Samuel Morrison had been the lighthouse keeper at Beacon Point for 43 years, 17 months and 6 days. He knew this precisely because he had marked every single dawn in the leather-bound logbook that his predecessor had passed to him, along with the brass key to the beacon room and the quiet understanding that some jobs were less about salary than about calling. The lighthouse stood 147 feet above the Atlantic, built from locally quarried granite in 1847 by men who understood that the sea was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and that the difference between the two often depended on whether ships could find safe harbor before storms turned navigation into a gamble with lives as stakes. Samuel had been 29 when he'd first climbed the 132 spiral steps to the beacon room, carrying his few possessions in a canvas bag and a head full of romantic notions about solitary heroism and the poetry of keeping light burning against darkness. He'd imagined himself as a guardian of maritime safety, a sentinel whose vigilance would guide vessels safely through treacherous waters while he contemplated the larger questions of existence from his tower above the waves. What he hadn't imagined was that 43 years later, he would still be climbing those same steps every evening at sunset, still checking the beacon's rotation mechanism, still recording wind speed and barometric pressure in handwriting that had evolved. From the eager loops of youth to the precise marks of a man who understood that accuracy in record-keeping could mean the difference between ships finding harbor and ships becoming statistics in maritime disaster reports. The Coast Guard had automated most lighthouses decades ago, replacing human keepers with GPS systems and electronic beacons that required only occasional maintenance visits from technicians who arrived by helicopter, performed their mechanical duties, and departed without spending a single night listening to the rhythm of waves against stone. Beacon Point was scheduled for automation in 1987, but the paperwork had been delayed, then forgotten, then refiled, then lost, then rediscovered, then assigned to a different department, then transferred to another bureaucracy entirely. Samuel had received official notices about his impending obsolescence approximately once every 18 months for the past 15 years. He had filed each notice carefully in a folder, labeled administrative correspondence, and had continued performing his duties with the same meticulous attention he had brought to the job when the government actually expected him to be there. The truth was that the Coast Guard had lost track of Beacon Point in the shuffle of modernization and budget cuts and personnel transfers. The lighthouse appeared on some computer systems as automated and on others as permanently staffed. The monthly supply deliveries continued arriving because no one had officially canceled them. Samuel's modest salary continued being deposited into his bank account because no one had filed the paperwork to discontinue his employment. He had become, through bureaucratic oversight, the last officially unofficial lighthouse keeper on the eastern seaboard. Samuel preferred it this way. Every evening at sunset, he climbed the 132 steps to the beacon room, checked the massive Fresnel lens for salt residue or bird strikes, verified that the rotation mechanism was functioning properly, and lit the beacon that would burn until dawn. Every morning he extinguished the light, recorded the previous night's weather conditions in the logbook, and performed the maintenance tasks that kept a 19th century lighthouse functioning in the 21st century. Between sunset and dawn, Samuel maintained radio contact with passing vessels, monitored weather broadcasts for approaching storms, and read books about maritime history, astronomy, navigation, and the philosophical questions that arose when a person spent enough time alone with the sea to understand that solitude and loneliness were different experiences entirely. Samuel was not lonely. He was alone, but he was alone in service of something larger than himself, and that service created connection to the thousands of vessels that passed Beacon Point each year, guided safely along their routes by the light that Samuel kept burning regardless of weather, season, or the coast guard's evolving understanding of whether his position was officially necessary. On this particular evening in November, as Samuel climbed the familiar steps while a late-season storm gathered momentum somewhere beyond the horizon, he carried with him a letter that had arrived that morning in the supply delivery. The envelope was addressed to the lighthouse keeper, Beacon Point, in handwriting that suggested urgency and careful attention to legibility. Samuel had received perhaps a dozen such letters over the decades, usually from maritime enthusiasts or amateur historians who had read about lighthouses and wanted to correspond with someone who represented a vanishing profession. He answered each letter thoughtfully, sharing stories about life at Beacon Point and the satisfaction that came from work that connected a person to both practical necessity and larger purpose. But this letter was different. The return address indicated it had been sent from a maritime museum in Nova Scotia, and the envelope contained not just a letter but a photograph and a ship's manifest from 1952. Letters from the deep. Samuel opened the letter in the beacon room, using the last natural light before sunset to read handwriting that belonged to someone who had learned to write when penmanship was considered a reflection of character and attention to detail. "Dear Lighthouse Keeper," the letter began, "my name is Catherine McLeod, and I am writing from the Maritime Museum of Nova Scotia regarding a ship called the Aurora Dawn that passed Beacon Point on November 15, 1952. According to our research, your lighthouse guided this vessel safely through a severe storm that night, allowing it to reach Halifax with its cargo and crew intact." Samuel paused, mentally calculating. November 1952 would have been 6 years before he had arrived at Beacon Point. The lighthouse keeper during that storm would have been Thomas McKenna, the man who had trained Samuel and had passed the job to him when arthritis made climbing the lighthouse steps impossible. Samuel remembered Thomas as a man who had approached lighthouse keeping with the same dedication Samuel had tried to bring to the work: meticulous attention to duty, genuine care for the welfare of mariners who depended on the beacon's reliability, and deep satisfaction in work that served purposes larger than personal comfort or convenience. The letter continued. The Aurora Dawn was carrying refugees from displaced persons camps in Europe to new lives in North America. Among the passengers was my grandmother, Margaret McLeod, who was traveling with her 3 children after losing her husband in the war. According to family stories passed down through 3 generations, the ship encountered a storm so severe that the captain was preparing to turn back to Boston, rather than risk continuing to Halifax in conditions that made navigation extremely dangerous. Samuel looked at the photograph that had accompanied the letter. It showed a young woman holding 2 small children, while a third child, perhaps 7 years old, stood beside her. All 4 looked directly at the camera with expressions that suggested they were posing for a photograph that would serve as documentation of survival, rather than celebration of arrival. My grandmother always credited the lighthouse at Beacon Point with saving their lives that night, the letter continued. She said that when it seemed like the storm might force the ship to turn back, which would have meant weeks of additional delay in refugee camps while they waited for another available vessel, the captain spotted your lighthouse beam through the storm and was able to navigate safely to Halifax Harbor. Samuel set down the letter and looked out at the sea, which was still calm but showing signs of the storm that weather reports predicted would arrive sometime after midnight. He tried to imagine the scene Catherine McLeod had described, a ship full of refugees who had already lost. So much that a storm-forced delay might have meant losing hope entirely, a captain making difficult decisions about acceptable risk, and Thomas McKenna climbing these same stairs to ensure that the beacon remained lit regardless of weather conditions that would have tested the lighthouse's structural integrity. The letter's final paragraph contained the information that had prompted Catherine McLeod to write after 70 years. My grandmother died last month at the age of 96. Among her possessions, we found a journal she had kept during the voyage from Europe to Halifax. The entry for November 15, 1952, describes the storm and specifically mentions the lighthouse keeper, who kept the light burning when lesser men might have sought shelter. She wrote that she wanted to find a way to thank the man who had stood watch that night, but she never knew how to contact him. Samuel opened the ship's manifest that had been included with the letter. The Aurora Dawn had carried 237 passengers from Bremen, Germany to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The manifest listed names, ages, countries of origin, and destination addresses where applicable. Many entries showed only refugee resettlement or displaced persons assistance in the destination column. Margaret McLeod was listed as traveling with 3 children: Catherine, age 7, James, age 5, and Mary, age 3. Under reason for travel, the manifest noted simply, war displacement, seeking new start. Samuel understood that Catherine McLeod had written not just to share a family story, but to complete a circle of gratitude that her grandmother had been carrying for 70 years. The letter was both historical documentation and emotional closure, acknowledgement of a connection between strangers that had been created by circumstances, sustained by duty, and remembered across decades. Samuel looked at his watch and saw that sunset was 15 minutes away. He set the letter carefully on the logbook table, wound the beacon's clockwork mechanism, and prepared to light the beam that would burn through another night, guiding whatever vessels needed guidance through whatever conditions the approaching storm would create. But first, he opened the logbook to November 15, 1952, and read Thomas McKenna's entry for the night he had helped save 237 refugees without knowing their names, their stories, or the gratitude they would carry for the rest of their lives. The automation that changed nothing. Thomas McKenna's handwriting in the 1952 logbook was precise and economical, recording essential information without editorial comment. November 15th. Storm arrived 2100 hours. Wind speed sustained 45 knots, gusts to 68. Barometric pressure 29.12 and falling. Beacon operational throughout night despite power fluctuations. Several vessels sought shelter in harbor. Radio contact maintained with merchant vessel Aurora Dawn during passage through storm conditions. All vessels reported safe arrival Halifax by 0600. Samuel compared Thomas's matter-of-fact documentation with Catherine McLeod's description of the same night. To Thomas, guiding the Aurora Dawn through the storm had been part of his regular duties, worth noting in the logbook but not worth special comment. To Margaret McLeod and 236 other refugees, Thomas's dedication that night had meant the difference between reaching safety and facing additional weeks of uncertainty. In displacement camps, Samuel realized that this gap between the lighthouse keeper's modest understanding of his work and the profound gratitude of people whose lives were affected by that work probably existed for most nights when he kept the beacon burning. Ships passed safely, their crews and passengers reaching destinations without drama or difficulty, never knowing how many potential disasters had been prevented by the simple reliability of a light that never failed to burn. Over the decades, Samuel had received occasional radio messages from ship's captains thanking him for guidance through difficult conditions. He had maintained polite correspondence with maritime enthusiasts who appreciated that Beacon Point remained traditionally operated rather than electronically automated. He had provided weather information to Coast Guard vessels and assisted with several search and rescue operations when ships had encountered mechanical difficulties or medical emergencies. But Samuel understood that the vast majority of his work was invisible to the people who benefited from it. Ships navigated safely past Beacon Point every night without their crews consciously noting the lighthouse's presence. The beacon was simply part of the reliable infrastructure that allowed maritime commerce and travel to function smoothly, taken for granted in the way that essential services usually were. Samuel had made peace with this invisibility years ago. He had learned to find satisfaction in work that was measured not by recognition or praise, but by the absence of maritime disasters in the waters he helped monitor. His success was counted in ships that reached their destinations without incident, in storms that passed without claiming vessels, in navigation that functioned so reliably that most mariners never had to think about what would happen if the light failed to burn. The Coast Guard's move toward automation had been motivated by exactly this reliability. Electronic beacons could provide consistent light without requiring human operators to climb stairs, monitor weather, maintain equipment, or live in isolation from conventional communities. Automated systems were more cost-effective, less dependent on individual dedication, and theoretically more reliable than systems that depended on human presence. But Samuel had observed several practical advantages to human lighthouse keeping that the automation advocates hadn't considered. Electronic systems could fail without anyone noticing until ships began experiencing navigation difficulties. Automated beacons couldn't provide real-time weather information, assist with emergency radio communications, or make judgment calls about when conditions required extra vigilance or modified procedures. More importantly, human lighthouse keepers could perform the intangible work of bearing witness, acknowledging the significance of each vessel that passed, maintaining awareness of the human consequences of navigation aids, and preserving the understanding that lighthouse keeping was about more than just producing light. Samuel understood that he was probably the last person who would ever approach lighthouse keeping as a calling, rather than as a job that happened to involve lighthouses. When he eventually retired or died, Beacon Point would be automated, and the Coast Guard would install electronic equipment that would function efficiently without requiring anyone to climb 132 steps every evening or to live in solitude with the sea. That inevitability didn't make Samuel bitter or nostalgic. It simply made him more determined to perform his duties with complete dedication for as long as he remained capable of performing them. If he was the last traditional lighthouse keeper, he wanted to be worthy of that distinction. Samuel finished reading Thomas McKenna's logbook entries from November 1952, then opened the current logbook to record the evening's conditions. Wind speed, 12 knots from the southwest. Barometric pressure, 29.78 and steady. Visibility, 8 miles. Beacon lit at 1743 hours. Then he added a note that departed from his usual laconic style. Received letter from granddaughter of refugee assisted by this lighthouse in 1952. Reminder that lighthouse keeping serves purposes larger than navigation. Some connections between strangers transcend time and geography. 40 years of solitary watch. Samuel's daily routine had evolved through 4 decades of repetition until it had achieved the kind of efficiency that came from eliminating unnecessary elements while preserving everything that served the essential function of keeping the lighthouse operational and the keeper sane. He woke at dawn, not because of an alarm clock, but because his circadian rhythm had synchronized itself with the cycle of lighting and extinguishing the beacon. He descended the lighthouse stairs, checked the beacon's fuel levels and mechanical components, recorded the night's weather conditions in the logbook, and extinguished the light that had burned since sunset. Breakfast was usually oatmeal, coffee, and whatever fruit had arrived in the previous day's supply delivery. Samuel ate while reading weather forecasts, maritime notices, and correspondence from the small network of lighthouse enthusiasts who appreciated that Beacon Point remained traditionally operated. Morning hours were devoted to maintenance tasks that kept a 19th century structure functioning reliably in 21st century weather conditions. Samuel painted ironwork to prevent rust, sealed windows and doors against storm damage, calibrated navigation equipment, and performed the dozens of small repairs that accumulated when buildings were exposed to constant salt air and seasonal storms. Lunch was simple, usually soup, bread, and tea consumed while reviewing maritime traffic reports and monitoring radio communications between ships and coastal authorities. Samuel tracked vessels that would be passing Beacon Point, noting their size, route, and estimated arrival time so he could provide assistance if they encountered navigation difficulties. Afternoon hours were Samuel's time for reading, correspondence, and the solitary pursuits that made lighthouse keeping psychologically sustainable. He had read extensively about maritime history, navigation techniques, meteorology, and astronomy. He maintained detailed weather records that had proven valuable to researchers studying long-term climate patterns in the North Atlantic. He corresponded with other lighthouse keepers, the few who remained, and with maritime museums that were interested in preserving knowledge about traditional lighthouse operations. Evening brought the central ritual of lighthouse keeping, climbing the stairs to the beacon room, checking the massive Fresnel lens and rotation mechanism, winding the clockwork system that would keep the light turning through the night, and lighting the beacon that would burn until dawn. Night hours were spent monitoring radio communications, tracking weather patterns, and reading in the beacon room while the light rotated with hypnotic regularity. Samuel had learned to sleep lightly, waking automatically when radio traffic indicated that vessels were experiencing difficulties or when weather conditions changed enough to require adjustments to the beacon's intensity or rotation schedule. This routine might have seemed monotonous to people accustomed to variety and social stimulation, but Samuel had discovered that repetition could be meditative rather than tedious when it served purposes that felt meaningful. Each day's duties were essentially identical to the previous day's duties, but they were also entirely new because weather, maritime traffic, and equipment conditions created continuous variations that required attention, judgment, and adaptation. Samuel had also learned that solitude was different from loneliness. Loneliness was the feeling of being disconnected from community and purpose. Solitude was the experience of being alone while maintaining connection to larger meanings and responsibilities. Samuel was profoundly alone. He spoke aloud to no one except during radio communications with passing vessels. But he was not lonely because his work connected him to the maritime community that depended on Beacon Point's reliability. Over 4 decades, Samuel had guided thousands of vessels safely past treacherous coastline during storms, fog, and conditions that could have resulted in shipwrecks if navigation aids had been unreliable. He had assisted with dozens of search and rescue operations, providing crucial coordination between distressed vessels and Coast Guard rescue teams. He had maintained weather records that had contributed to scientific understanding of climate patterns and storm formation in the North Atlantic. More importantly, Samuel had preserved knowledge and techniques that would be lost when lighthouse keeping was completely automated. He understood how to maintain 19th century equipment using tools and methods that were no longer taught in technical schools. He could read weather patterns and see conditions with accuracy that electronic instruments couldn't match. He knew how to make judgment calls about when maritime conditions required human intervention rather than automated response. Samuel had written extensively about these techniques, creating documentation that maritime museums and Coast Guard historians could use to preserve knowledge about traditional lighthouse operations. He had trained several Coast Guard personnel in manual backup procedures for automated systems, ensuring that essential skills wouldn't be completely lost when the last human lighthouse keepers retired. But Samuel's most important contribution might have been demonstrating that some work was worth doing regardless of whether it was officially necessary, economically efficient, or personally rewarding in conventional ways. Lighthouse keeping had taught him that duty was its own satisfaction, that service to purposes larger than personal comfort could provide meaning that transcended material circumstances, and that some forms of heroism were too quiet and consistent to be recognized as heroic. As Samuel prepared to face what weather forecasters were calling the most severe November storm in recorded history for this region, he reflected on 40 years of storms weathered, vessels guided, and nights when he had been the only human awake for miles in any direction, keeping light burning against darkness while others slept safely in their beds. The storm of the century approaches. The Weather Service had been tracking the low-pressure system for 6 days as it gathered strength over the North Atlantic, pulling moisture from unusually warm ocean currents and organizing itself into what meteorologists were describing as a perfect storm, a combination of atmospheric conditions that occurred perhaps once in a generation and created weather events that redefined regional understanding of what nature could produce when multiple systems aligned with destructive synchronicity. Samuel had experienced hundreds of storms during his 43 years at Beacon Point, but this approaching system registered higher on every measurement scale than any weather he had previously monitored. Sustained winds were forecast to exceed 80 knots, with gusts potentially reaching hurricane strength. Wave heights could approach 40 feet. Barometric pressure was dropping toward levels that indicated the storm's core possessed energy, equivalent to several conventional weather systems combined. The Coast Guard had issued warnings for all maritime traffic to seek protected harbors before the storm's arrival, projected for some time after midnight. Commercial shipping companies had rerouted vessels or delayed departures to avoid encountering the worst conditions. Fishing fleets had returned to port 2 days early. Even Coast Guard vessels had been recalled to avoid risking personnel and equipment in conditions that exceeded safe operational parameters. Samuel had spent the day securing Beacon Point for weather that would test the lighthouse's structural integrity in ways that its 19th century builders had designed for, but that had never been fully tested by actual conditions. He had sealed windows with storm shutters that hadn't been used in 15 years. He had secured outdoor equipment, supplies, and anything that could become projectiles in winds that would treat normal objects as weapons. He had checked the beacon's mechanical systems and backup equipment, ensuring that the light could continue functioning even if primary power systems failed. Most importantly, Samuel had stocked the beacon room with enough supplies to remain at his post for several days without descending the lighthouse stairs because he understood that once the storm reached full intensity, the safest place in the lighthouse would be the beacon room itself, and the most dangerous thing he could do would be to abandon his duties when conditions made navigation most difficult for any vessels that might be caught in the storm despite official warnings. At 4:00 p.m., Samuel received a radio call from Coast Guard Station Boston with final instructions for lighthouse personnel during the approaching emergency. Beacon Point, this is Coast Guard Boston. Please confirm your evacuation status. Samuel keyed his radio microphone with the practiced efficiency of someone who had maintained radio communications for decades. Coast Guard Boston, this is Beacon Point. Lighthouse keeper remaining on station. Beacon Point, negative on remaining on station. Storm conditions exceed safe operational parameters for Lighthouse personnel. Confirm evacuation transportation arrangements. Samuel looked out the beacon. Room windows at seas that were already showing white caps despite relatively moderate winds. Knowing that within 6 hours the ocean would be transformed into something that would challenge the Lighthouse's ability to withstand forces that could reshape coastlines and alter navigation charts. Coast Guard Boston, Beacon Point Lighthouse Keeper declining evacuation. Beacon will remain operational throughout storm duration. The radio was silent for 30 seconds, long enough for the Coast Guard operator to consult with supervisors about how to handle a lighthouse keeper who was refusing evacuation orders during what could be the most dangerous storm in regional history. Beacon Point, be advised that Coast Guard cannot provide emergency assistance during storm conditions. You are strongly urged to evacuate immediately. Coast Guard Boston, understood and acknowledged. Beacon Point will maintain radio contact as conditions permit. Lighthouse keeping personnel prepared to assist any vessels requiring navigation guidance during storm passage. Samuel signed off the radio and made final preparations for a night that would either validate his 43 years of dedication to lighthouse keeping or provide a dramatic conclusion to his career as the last traditional keeper on the eastern seaboard. He wound the beacon's clockwork mechanism to maximum spring tension, providing enough stored energy to keep the light rotating for 12 hours without manual intervention. He arranged emergency supplies within reach of the beacon controls. He opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote, November 17th, storm of historic proportions approaching. Beacon operational. Lighthouse keeper at station, ready to assist maritime traffic as required. Then Samuel lit the beacon and prepared to guide whatever vessels needed guidance through the worst conditions any lighthouse keeper had faced in living memory. Messages in bottles and radio waves. As the storm's outer bands reached Beacon Point around 8 p.m., Samuel began receiving radio communications that told him he would not be spending the night alone with wind and waves. Despite Coast Guard warnings and shipping company precautions, several vessels had been caught by the storm's faster than predicted arrival and were now struggling to navigate toward safe harbor in conditions that made electronic navigation unreliable and visual navigation nearly impossible. The first call came from the Molly's Pride, a fishing vessel that had been returning from the Grand Banks when the storm accelerated beyond forecast models. Captain Rodriguez reported that his GPS system was malfunctioning due to interference from the storm's electrical activity, and that he needed radio guidance to navigate around shoals that lay between his current position and the protected harbor at Port Judith. Samuel consulted his nautical charts and provided Rodriguez with compass headings that would guide the Molly's Pride safely around underwater hazards while keeping the vessel within range of Beacon Point's light. As winds increased beyond 60 knots and visibility dropped to near zero, Samuel's radio became the lifeline connecting Rodriguez to safe navigation in conditions where a navigational error of even a few degrees could result in the vessel running aground on rocks that had claimed ships for 3 centuries. The second vessel requiring assistance was the Atlantic Messenger, a cargo ship that had been en route from Boston to Halifax when the storm's arrival forced a decision between turning back toward uncertain shelter or continuing forward toward ports that might already be closed due to dangerous harbor conditions. Captain Chen requested current weather information and harbor status updates that would help her decide whether to continue or to ride out the storm in open ocean. Samuel provided Chen with real-time barometric pressure readings, wind speed measurements, and radio contacts with harbor authorities that allowed her to make informed decisions about navigation routes that would minimize her vessel's exposure to the worst storm conditions while keeping her crew and cargo safe. The third call was more troubling. The Sarah Lynn, a pleasure craft with 4 people aboard, had been caught in the storm while attempting to reach harbor after a sailing trip that had extended longer than planned. Captain Morrison reported that his boat was taking on water, that his bilge pumps were struggling to keep ahead of seepage, and that he was having difficulty maintaining course in seas that were approaching the small vessel's design limitations. Samuel immediately contacted Coast Guard Rescue Coordination, providing Morrison's position and condition report to emergency responders who could dispatch rescue vessels as soon as weather conditions permitted. But Samuel also understood that Coast Guard assistance might not be available for several hours, and that the Sarah Lynn needed immediate guidance to reach protected waters before taking on more water than her pumps could handle. Sarah Lynn, This is Beacon Point Lighthouse. Samuel radioed. I'm showing you approximately 12 miles southeast of my position. Can you see the lighthouse beam? Morrison's voice crackled through radio static generated by the storm's electrical activity. Beacon Point, affirmative on lighthouse beam. Intermittent visual due to wave height and precipitation. Sarah Lynn. Recommend course. Change to 315 degrees magnetic. This heading will bring you to sheltered water behind Gull Island, approximately 4 miles from your current position. Harbor entrance marked by red and green navigation lights. Samuel spent the next 2 hours providing continuous radio guidance to Morrison, as the Sarah Lynn slowly fought through conditions that tested both the vessel's seaworthiness and the crew's endurance. By 11:30 p.m., Morrison reported safe arrival in protected harbor, with all 4 people aboard uninjured, despite 6 hours of challenging navigation in a storm that had turned a recreational sailing trip into a survival ordeal. As the storm reached full intensity after midnight, Samuel realized that his decision to remain at Beacon Point despite evacuation orders had already justified itself. 3 vessels with 19 people aboard had reached safety because the lighthouse remained operational, with a keeper who could provide real-time navigation assistance, weather, information, and radio coordination with rescue services. But the storm was just reaching its peak intensity, and Samuel's radio was receiving additional distress calls from vessels that had been caught in conditions that exceeded both forecast predictions and the capabilities of electronic navigation systems to function reliably in severe weather. The ship that shouldn't have been there. At 1:47 a.m., during the storm's most intense phase when winds exceeded 90 knots and waves reached heights that challenged Beacon Point's 147-foot elevation above sea level, Samuel received a radio call that initially made no sense according to his understanding of current maritime traffic and Coast Guard warnings. Beacon Point, this is merchant vessel New Dawn. Request immediate navigation assistance. Repeat, New Dawn requesting emergency navigation guidance. Samuel consulted his shipping charts and radio logs, finding no record of a vessel named New Dawn scheduled to transit this area during the storm period. More puzzling, the radio signal was unusually clear despite atmospheric conditions that had been disrupting communications for hours. New Dawn, this is Beacon Point. Please provide your current position and nature of emergency. The response came in a voice that sounded younger than most merchant ship captains, with an accent that Samuel couldn't immediately identify. Beacon Point, New Dawn approximately 10 miles southwest of your position. Carrying refugees from conflict zone, navigation equipment damaged by storm. Urgently need guidance to nearest safe harbor. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with November storm conditions. The terminology, refugees from conflict zone, hadn't been commonly used in maritime communications for decades, and the radio equipment producing such clear transmission quality during severe weather suggested technology that shouldn't be available on vessels carrying displaced persons fleeing regional conflicts. New Dawn, confirm your last port of departure and destination harbor. Beacon Point departed European port for North American resettlement. Passengers include families displaced by conflict. Request guidance to Halifax Harbor or nearest acceptable alternative. Samuel opened Thomas McKenna's 1952 logbook to the entry he had read earlier that evening, comparing the radio communication he was receiving with the description of the Aurora Dawn's transit during a historic storm 70 years earlier. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Merchant vessel carrying refugees, departure from European port, destination Halifax, navigation assistance required during severe storm conditions. Samuel keyed his microphone with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold or exhaustion, but from the recognition that he might be experiencing something that transcended normal understanding of time, navigation, and the connections that could exist between lighthouse keepers separated by decades but united by identical dedication to guiding vessels safely through dangerous conditions. New Dawn, this is Beacon Point. I can provide guidance to Halifax Harbor. Course heading 287 degrees magnetic from your current position. Distance approximately 42 nautical miles to harbor entrance. Beacon Point, thank you for navigation assistance. Passengers very grateful for lighthouse keepers' help. Many families aboard seeking new life after losing everything to war. Samuel provided detailed navigation instructions to the New Dawn, guiding the vessel around shoals, shipping lanes, and weather conditions that could complicate the transit to Halifax. The radio communications continued for 3 hours, with Samuel serving as the link between a ship full of refugees and the safe harbor that represented their first step toward rebuilding lives that had been disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. At 4:23 a.m., the captain of the New Dawn reported safe arrival in Halifax Harbor. Beacon Point, New Dawn secured to dock Halifax. All passengers and crew safe. Please accept our gratitude for navigation assistance during dangerous conditions. Lighthouse Keeper's dedication saved many lives tonight. Samuel acknowledged the final transmission and signed off his radio, then sat in the beacon room as dawn began to break through storm clouds that were finally starting to dissipate. He looked at the logbook entry he had written throughout the night, documenting his assistance to the New Dawn with the same matter-of-fact precision that Thomas McKenna had used to record, helping the Aurora Dawn in 1952. Samuel understood that he would never be able to prove that the New Dawn had been anything other than a conventional merchant vessel that had requested navigation assistance during the storm. Maritime authorities would have no record of the ship's arrival in Halifax, just as they had incomplete records of many refugee vessels that had sought North American sanctuary during decades of global conflict and displacement. But Samuel also understood that lighthouse keeping had taught him to accept mystery as part of his duties. He had spent 43 years guiding vessels through conditions that required faith rather than certainty, trust rather than complete information, and commitment to helping strangers reach safety, regardless of who they were or how their presence in dangerous waters could be explained. The final entry in the logbook. As the storm finally passed and morning light revealed the extent of damage to Beacon Point, Samuel assessed the lighthouse's condition with the practiced attention of someone who had weathered hundreds of storms and understood how to distinguish between cosmetic damage and structural problems that could affect operational capability. The lighthouse itself had withstood the storm's assault with the resilient dignity of 19th-century granite construction. Several windows had been cracked by wind-driven debris, and the exterior paint would require refinishing, but the beacon room remained intact, and the light mechanism had functioned throughout the night without interruption. Samuel's radio crackled with reports from Coast Guard stations, maritime authorities, and news services documenting the storm's impact on coastal communities throughout the region. Dozens of vessels had sought emergency shelter. Several harbors had sustained significant damage. Weather monitoring stations had recorded wind speeds and wave heights that established new records for November storms in the North Atlantic. But Samuel was most interested in reports about the vessels he had assisted during the night. Coast Guard records confirmed that the Molly's Pride, Atlantic Messenger, and Sarah Lynn had all reached safe harbor during the storm, guided by radio communications with Beacon Point Lighthouse. Search and rescue personnel had been prepared to assist these vessels, but Samuel's navigation guidance had enabled them to reach safety without requiring emergency intervention. Samuel found no mention in official reports of the New Dawn or its cargo of refugees seeking resettlement in North America. Halifax harbor authorities had no record of the vessel's arrival, and maritime traffic databases showed no shipping scheduled under that name during the storm period. Samuel opened the lighthouse logbook and began writing his final entry as the last traditional lighthouse keeper. At Beacon Point, November 18th, historic storm passed during night hours. Sustained winds 91 knots, gusts to 106 knots. Barometric pressure minimum 28.47 inches. Wave height estimated 38 to 42 feet. Beacon operational throughout storm duration. Provided navigation assistance to 4 vessels during storm passage. Fishing vessel Molly's Pride, 6 souls aboard. Cargo ship Atlantic Messenger, 23 souls aboard. Pleasure craft Sarah Lynn, 4 souls aboard. And merchant vessel New Dawn, passenger. Manifest unavailable. Estimated 200+ souls aboard seeking refuge from conflict. All vessels reported safe arrival at intended destinations. No loss of life in waters monitored by Beacon Point Lighthouse during storm event. This lighthouse keeper has served at Beacon Point for 43 years, 17 months, and 7 days. During this service, thousands of vessels have passed safely through these waters, guided by light that has burned every night regardless of weather, equipment failures, or bureaucratic changes in lighthouse operation policies. I have learned that lighthouse keeping is about more than producing light. It is about maintaining connection between strangers separated by vast distances, It is about preserving knowledge and techniques that serve purposes larger than immediate practical necessity. It is about understanding that some work is worth doing whether or not it is officially required, economically efficient, or personally rewarding in conventional terms. Most importantly, lighthouse keeping is about faith. Faith that the light will matter to someone even if the lighthouse keeper never learns who that someone is or how the light affected their journey. I have been privileged to serve as lighthouse keeper during a period when this work was transitioning from human operation to electronic automation. I have tried to demonstrate that human dedication can provide services that automated systems cannot match, and that some traditions are worth preserving, even when they seem obsolete to people who measure value in terms of cost-effectiveness rather than meaning. Effective immediately, I am retiring from lighthouse service. The beacon will be lit each evening until Coast Guard personnel arrive to install automated equipment. I trust that electronic systems will provide reliable navigation assistance to future maritime traffic passing Beacon Point. However, I also believe that something essential will be lost when lighthouse keeping becomes completely automated. Ships will continue to navigate safely past this point, but they will navigate past equipment rather than past another human being who has chosen to dedicate his life to their safe passage. The difference matters, even if the practical result is identical. To future mariners who pass Beacon Point, the light will continue burning, but it will burn without the awareness, concern, and dedication that human lighthouse keepers brought to this work for more than a century. You will receive the same navigation assistance, but you will not receive the blessing of knowing that someone has chosen to stand watch while you travel through dangerous waters. To future lighthouse keepers, if any remain, this work offers rewards that cannot be measured in salary or recognition. It offers connection to purposes larger than individual comfort. It offers the satisfaction of service that benefits strangers without requiring their gratitude or acknowledgement. It offers solitude that is different from loneliness because it is solitude in service of community rather than solitude as escape from community. Most importantly, it offers the understanding that some lights are worth keeping burning regardless of whether anyone is watching. Final entry, Samuel Morrison, lighthouse keeper, Beacon Point Light Station. When dawn breaks, after the longest night, Samuel closed the logbook, wound the beacon mechanism for the final time, and prepared to descend the 132 spiral steps that had defined his daily routine for more than 4 decades. But before leaving the beacon room, he performed one last ritual that felt appropriate for marking the end of an era in maritime history. He opened the beacon's access panel and removed a small metal cylinder that he had placed there 43 years earlier on his first day as lighthouse keeper. Inside the cylinder was a letter he had written to himself, a young man's attempt to communicate with whatever older version of himself would eventually read it. Samuel opened the letter and read handwriting that seemed to belong to someone he had known long ago, but had gradually become through decades of daily choices about how to approach work that could have been performed as routine duty, but had instead been practiced as a form of devotion. To the Samuel Morrison who reads this, his younger self had written, "I hope you have learned that lighthouse keeping is about more than maintaining equipment and following procedures. I hope you have discovered that this work connects you to every person who passes safely through these waters, even if you never learn their names or hear their thanks. I hope you have found satisfaction in work that serves purposes larger than personal ambition or material reward. Most importantly, I hope you have understood that keeping the light burning is not just a job responsibility but a form of prayer, a daily affirmation that light matters more than darkness, that help matters more than indifference, and that some things are worth doing simply because they need to be done." Samuel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the metal cylinder, along with a new letter addressed to whoever would eventually serve as the final lighthouse keeper, when electronic automation finally failed and human backup became necessary again. To whoever reads this, Samuel wrote, "Lighthouse keeping is the practice of standing watch while others sleep, maintaining connection while others travel, and keeping light burning while others navigate through darkness. It is work that creates community between strangers, that serves purposes larger than the lighthouse keeper's immediate concerns, and that provides meaning that transcends the practical necessity of navigation assistance. The sea is beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The difference between beauty and danger often depends on whether reliable light is available when travelers need guidance through treacherous conditions. Keep the light burning. The rest will take care of itself. Samuel sealed the cylinder and returned it to the beacon mechanism, where future maintenance personnel would find it when automated systems eventually required human intervention. He took a final look around the beacon room that had been his workplace, observatory, and meditation space for 43 years, then began his descent to the lighthouse's base. As Samuel reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard a helicopter approaching Beacon Point. The Coast Guard was arriving to begin the automation process that would transform the lighthouse from human workplace to electronic navigation aid. Samuel gathered his few personal possessions, clothing, books, letters, and the photograph of Margaret MacLeod and her children that Catherine MacLeod had sent from Nova Scotia, and prepared to leave the lighthouse that had been his home and his calling for more than 4 decades. But before he left, Samuel performed one final duty. He climbed back up the 132 spiral steps to the beacon room, lit the evening beacon even though sunset was still hours away, and ensured that the light would be burning when Coast Guard personnel arrived to take custody of equipment that had been maintained by human dedication, but would henceforth be operated by electronic automation. Samuel understood that the light would continue burning after he left. Ships would continue to navigate safely past Beacon Point. Electronic systems would provide reliable navigation assistance for decades to come. But Samuel also understood that something essential had ended with his retirement. The understanding that lighthouse keeping was about more than producing light, that some work was worth doing regardless of official necessity, and that the connections between strangers could transcend time, distance, and the practical limitations of human presence. As the Coast Guard helicopter landed near the lighthouse, Samuel walked toward his new life carrying the knowledge that he had kept the light burning for 43 years, 17 months and 7 days, and that during that time, thousands of vessels had passed safely through waters that could have claimed them if the light had ever failed. The light had never failed, and in the end, Samuel thought, that was the only measure of success that mattered for lighthouse keeping. Not recognition or gratitude or official acknowledgement, but the simple fact that the light had burned every night, regardless of weather, circumstances, or the lighthouse keeper's personal comfort. Some work was its own reward. Some dedication created its own meaning. Some lights were worth keeping burning simply because darkness was the alternative. Samuel Morrison, the last lighthouse keeper at Beacon Point, walked toward the Coast Guard helicopter carrying 43 years of storm-weathered wisdom and the deep satisfaction that comes from work completed, faithfully, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Behind him, the beacon burned bright against the afternoon sky, a testament to human dedication that would continue guiding vessels safely home long after the lighthouse keeper who lit it had become another story that families told to explain how strangers sometimes choose to dedicate their lives to the safety of other strangers they will never meet.